This is Chapter 3, Part 4, Classical Greek Civilization. We're going to focus this last section on Greek philosophy. Ancient Greek philosophy can be summed up with the quote, "Know thyself," which was inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Philosophy came from the Greeks' fascination with rational inquiry. The materialists studied the substance of which all matter was composed. The idealists worked at finding evidence of a divine or rational plan for the cosmos. Pythagoras is an example of this. And the sophists were professional teachers and skeptics. Protagoras is an example. Aspasia is an example. They became cynical. As a side note, sophists are also the precursors to rhetoricians of this day and age. And like me, who also teach English, often have degrees in rhetoric. And again, sophist is the origin of that. Now, the ancient Greek philosophers gave us the basic categories of philosophy, beginning with metaphysics. Metaphysics is the part of philosophy that asks questions such as what is the world made of, and what is the ultimate substance of all reality. In fact, the ancient Greeks were among the first to suggest that there is a true reality under the apparent reality, an unseen real beneath the unreal seen. The question is what is this truth reality? Is it matter and energy, something physical? If so, it's called materialism. Or something more spiritual or mental, such as ideas or ideals. This is called idealism. Materialism and idealism are just two of the extreme answers. Another aspect of philosophy is epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge, or how do we know what is true or false, what is real or not? Can we know anything for certain, or is it ultimately hopeless? Again, the Greeks outlined two opposing approaches to the problem of knowledge. One is called empiricism, which says that all knowledge comes through the senses. The other is called rationalism, which says that knowledge is a matter of reason and thought. And there are other answers in epistemology as well. They've never been exclusive. A third aspect of philosophy that is always brought up is ethics. And ethics is the classical understanding of good and bad, right and wrong. It's often called morality, and most consider the two words ethics and morality synonymous. After all, ethics comes from ethos, which is the Greek for custom, and morality comes from mores. Now, the extremes of ethics are hedonism and cynicism. Hedonism says that good and bad come down to what I like and what I don't like, what gives me pleasure and what gives me pain. Cynicism says that the world is essentially evil, and we can only work at distancing ourselves from it and moving towards the ultimate good, which is God. Protagoras was the most famous of the group of philosophers known as the sophists. Now, the word Greek sophiste, which means teachers of wisdom, i.e. a professor, because some of these professors taught little more than how to win arguments in court and did so for exact fees, the names often become somewhat derogatory. Sophistry now means argument for argument's sake or for the sake of personal gain, but then it also is the root of the word sophisticated. Protagoras, though his teaching fees were very high, was still a serious philosopher. He can be credited with founding the science of grammar, being the first to distinguish the conjugations of verbs and nouns. He was also a major contributor to logic in using the Socratic method, which is teaching by question and answer, long before Socrates. He was a skeptic and believed that there were no ultimate truths, that truth is a relative, subjective thing. Man is the measure of all things, is his most famous quote, meaning things are what they say they are. Applying this skepticism to the gods, he scared the Athenian powers that be, and he was ordered to leave Athens. Apparently, he drowned on his way to Sicily. Into this idea-rich environment would come the three Athenians that would come to dominate philosophy for the next 2,000 years: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. All three of the philosophers mentioned lived in Athens for most of their lives, and they knew each other. Socrates came first, Plato was a student, and After Socrates was killed, Plato began his work by writing down what Socrates had taught, and then continued by writing down his own opening school. Aristotle, who was younger, came to study at Plato's school and ended up starting his own school as well. In the years after Plato and Aristotle died, three famous kinds of philosophy started up in the schools that Plato and Aristotle had started. They're the Stoics, Skeptics, and Epicureans. Each of these continued to be important to the ways of thinking about the world all through the Roman Empire until people converted to Christianity in the 300s Common Era, and even after that. Socrates, despite his foundational place in the history of ideas, actually wrote nothing. Most of our knowledge of him comes from the works of Plato. And since Plato had other concerns in mind than simple historical accuracy, it's usually impossible to determine how much of his thinking actually arrives and derives from Socrates. The most accurate of Plato's writing on Socrates is probably the Apology. It's Plato's account of Socrates' defense at his trial. It's clear, however, that Plato dressed up Socrates' speech to turn it into justification for Socrates' life and death. In it, Plato outlined some of Socrates' most famous philosophical ideas: the necessity of doing what one thinks is right, even in the face of universal opposition, and the need to pursue knowledge even when opposed. Socrates wrote nothing because he felt that knowledge was a living, interactive thing. Socrates' method of philosophical inquiry consisted in questioning people on the positions they asserted and working them through questions into a contradiction, thus proving to them that their original assertion was wrong. Socrates himself never takes a position. In the Apology, he radically and skeptically claims to know nothing at all, except that he knows nothing. Socrates and Plato refer to this method as elenchus, which means something like cross-examination. This method eventually gave rise to the dialectic, the idea that truth needs to be pursued by modifying one's position through questioning and conflict with opposing ideas. It is this idea of the truth being pursued rather than discovered that characterizes Socratic thought in much of our worldview today. The most famous student of Socrates is, of course, Plato, as we've already mentioned. Plato was a young aristocrat who carried on much of his former teacher's work and eventually founded his own school, the Academy, in 385. In fact, many universities and colleges refer to them as the Academy, and much of the college culture refers to itself as the Academy as a body as a whole because of this name of Plato's school. The Academy would become in its time the most famous school in the classical world, and its most famous pupil was Aristotle. We know a lot about Plato because he wrote dialogues between Socrates and others that explore philosophical issues. These dialogues would be used in a school as starting points for discussion, and these discussions and Plato's final word on the dialogues have all been lost to us. But the Platonic dialogues consist of Socrates asking questions of another and proving through these questions that the other person has the wrong idea on the subject. Initially, Plato seems to have carried on the philosophy of Socrates, concentrating on lexical examination of basic ethical issues, such as what is friendship, what's virtue, can virtue be taught? In these early Platonic dialogues, Socrates questions one person and proves through these questions that the other person has the wrong idea on the subject. These dialogues never answer the questions they begin with. Later, Plato began to define philosophy, and Socrates of the later dialogues does more teaching than he does questioning. This fundamental aspect of Plato's thought is that the theory of ideas or forms. Plato, like other Greek philosophers, was stymied by the question of change in the physical world. The main belief was that there was nothing certain or stable except for the fact that things change. But then change, motion, and time was thought to be an illusion. So where was the truth? How could these two opposite positions be reconciled? It's a paradox. The most famous of Plato's dialogues is called The Republic, and it is one of the single most influential works of philosophy. Essentially, it deals with the central problem of how to live a good life, looking at parallel questions such as what is justice, what would an ideal state be, and what is a just individual. This Republic is actually really influential on Cicero, who we will talk about in the next chapter, who in fact writes his own book called The Republic. Now, Plato's Republic really focused on the idea of a citizen and what that citizen should be, and became a model for others to talk about citizenship. To this day, people use it as a model. Now, as already pointed out, Aristotle was Plato's most famous student. Now, often he is known as the father of theater, literature, and all kinds of things because he left all these dictates about how and why we should do things. Aristotle represents for most of us an icon of difficult philosophical thinking. To know Aristotle often provokes hush whispers even from highly educated people. Of his reputation, though, Aristotle is actually quite an easy read because he lays it all out for us with incredible clarity and superhuman precision. It's really not possible to talk about Western culture without coming to terms with this often difficult and often inspiring philosopher who did not get along with Plato and didn't get along with just about everybody because he was a know-it-all. We can say without exaggeration that we live in an Aristotelian world. Wherever you see modern Western science dominating culture in any meaningful way, Aristotle is there in some form. Aristotle was born in Thrace. His father was a physician to the king of Macedon, so science was his background. At the age of 17, he went to Athens to join Plato's school, where he stayed until Plato. A few years later, he became the tutor to the young prince of Macedon, Alexander the Great. And although Alexander was a stellar pupil, Aristotle returned to Athens a few years later and founded his own school, the Lyceum, and taught and studied there for 12 years. Because Alexander began conquering all of the known world, the Macedonians became somewhat unwelcome in Athens, and Aristotle was a shown mentor in 323 BCE. He died just a year later. Although he studied under Plato, he fundamentally disagreed with his teacher on just about everything. He believed the world could be understood at a fundamental level, which is fundamentally empirical, which is the basis of science. He literally taught everything: poetics, rhetoric, ethics, politics, meteorology, embryology, physics, mathematics, metaphysics, anatomy, physiology, logic, dreams, etc. I don't know never came out of his mouth. In addition to studying everything, he was the first person to really think about the problem of evidence and supporting an argument. If he approached a problem, he would examine what people had previously written or said, the general consensus of opinions, and a systematic study of everything else. This is how we still do research today, called inductive reasoning, observing as many examples as possible and then working out the underlying principles. It is the foundation of the Western method. 3 other characteristics stand out in Aristotle's thought: understanding knowledge, the 4 causes, and the ethical doctrine of the mean. And those are all explained in greater detail elsewhere.